Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new installment of our department's research seminar. That's the Department for Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the research seminar is organized jointly with CELFIS, that's the Center for Logic, Philosophy, and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and ICUB, that's the Research Institute at the same university, the Humanities section. We're delighted that the speaker series is supported via postdoctoral grant granted by WEFISCDI, that's the local public funding agency for research. And the code of that project is PN-3-1-1-PD-2019-0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor. Tonight's speaker is a dear friend of ours and a long-standing friend of the CELFIS speaker series. That's David Kovacs from Tel Aviv University. David's talk is titled Towards an Ontology of Nations. David, I'm very eager to hear what you have to say, so please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for coming, especially as I just learned that this is like a holiday time or season in Bucharest. So I especially appreciate that you nonetheless decided to spend your holiday this way. So I'm really excited to give this talk also because this is a fairly new project for me. I haven't done a lot of work on social ontology. The paper on which this talk is based is basically my first excursion into social ontology. So I'm really excited to hear what you're going to have to say about it. So the title is Toward an Ontology of Nations. So I'm going to start with some terminology. So what do I mean by nation for the rest of this talk? So nation, as it's usually used in colloquial English, it's a somewhat ambiguous word. In many contexts, it refers to a country. Sometimes it refers to a citizenry, the citizenry of a country. So, for example, when we say things like this school is the best school in the entire nation, that's the country sense of nation. In many contexts, we just mean the citizenry of a country. So in the present talk, that's not exactly how I'm going to understand nation. I'm basically going to understand it the way political philosophers usually use it in the context of philosophical defenses of nationalism or the criticisms of it. Also in the way that people tend to use it in ethnography or nationalism studies. So in the sense I'm using it, a nation is a collection of people with certain shared characteristics. I'm going to have a bit more to say about what kinds of characteristics I have in mind here, which may or may not coincide with the citizenry. Typically, it doesn't exactly coincide with the citizenry. So just to give you a taste of the notion that I'm using. So the American nation would be an example. The American nation might be an exception to the rule. So that everything I'm going to say is very arguable, obvious, but that might be an example of a nation that more or less coincides with the citizenry. The Kurdish nation would be a nation in this sense, a stateless one, of course. So the Kurdish nation doesn't even nearly coincide with the citizenry. The Estonian nation would be an example. Again, I give this example because in the sense I'm using it, it doesn't coincide with a citizenry. Roughly only a bit more than 60% of Estonia's citizenry are Estonians in the nation sense that I'm using in the present talk. The Japanese nation would be another one. So hopefully you get the hang of it, even without a formal definition. So here are some more clarifications. So I just noted that the sense in which I intend to use nation is the one that is at issue in philosophical evaluations of various sorts of nationalism. So typically, much of the philosophical literature on nationalism starts with this very famous description of Benedict Anderson, according to which a nation is something like an imagined community. But it's become very common, at least in the political philosophy literature, to not go much beyond that. And the main reason for this is that it's just so difficult to say what a nation is beyond this idea that it's, in some sense, it's an imagined community. In some sense, it's some kind of a collection of people according to, under some sort of constructed property. So one thing on which people do tend to agree in the political philosophy literature, at least, is that a nation is the sort of thing with a prima facie right to self-determination. So I'm saying prima facie because it's, of course, a hotly contested issue. It's a hotly contested question if nations actually have this right. But there do seems to be a broad agreement that the thing concerning which is controversial whether it has that right, that's the sort of thing that people have in mind when they talk about nations. So some theorists went so far with this that, according to David Miller, for example, a very influential defender of liberal nationalism in political philosophy, this basically exhausts the notion of a nation. So that's David Miller's semi-official definition of a nation, the sort of collective that possesses this presumptive right to self-determination. And of course, this also has been criticized. So Omar Dabur argues, for example, that this basically empties the notion of its content. But all I'm trying to do now is just to give you a rough idea of the sort of thing I'm going to talk about. So I should note that it is also somewhat common to distinguish between nations and peoples, where the idea is that the members of a nation have certain shared characteristics, and they are also aware of their distinctiveness in virtue of those characteristics, whereas a mere people that is not a nation might be a collection of persons who do have these shared characteristics, but who might lack self-awareness concerning it. And accordingly, they might lack collective political ambitions of autonomy or independence. So I'm not going to enter these otherwise very interesting debates. I'm not going to have much to say about the difference between nations and peoples. I'm going to just focus on nations. So just a few more clarifications. So in this talk, I'm primarily interested in what a nation is. I'm not necessarily interested in what a nation should be. So the approach, you could say that the approach I'm taking is not in the tradition of ameliorative analysis. It's closer to something like conceptual analysis, even though I'm not attempting to actually give an analysis, but I'm going to try to understand the standing, the metaphysical correlate of the standing notion of a nation. So the result of this inquiry might well be criticizable. So it's perfectly consistent with what I'm going to say, that some nations should change their own self-conceptions about their own boundaries. But I'm going to focus on what their boundaries actually are, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or I'm going to focus what a nation actually is, whether it is a good thing that it's the sort of thing that I'm going to say that it is. So why am I interested in the metaphysics of nations? Why do I think this is an interesting project? So as I just mentioned, in political philosophy, nations are usually assumed to be the sorts of things that have this presumptive right to self-determination, where it's contested again whether they have this right, but there's broad agreement that if any kind of collection has this right, then a nation would be a pretty good candidate for having it. It's also worth noting that it's also perfectly possible that under some conceptions of the nation, nations are the sorts of things that have the right to self-determination, and under other conceptions, they aren't. Again, this is an issue that is obviously relevant to my project, but which I'm not going to try to adjudicate. So here's my starting point, or here's the terrain that I'm going to take as my starting point, just so you better see where I'm coming from. Once I'm going to try to give a metaphysical picture of nations. So the various contenders for the types of collectives which are nations. And here I'm drawing not just on the political philosophy literature, but also on history, ethnography, political science, so various neighboring areas. So some very useful taxonomies can be found in two books by Paul Gilbert and Chaim Gans. So various competing conceptions of the nation include ethnic conceptions. So according to ethnic conceptions, what ties the members of a nation together is shared ancestry. So that could be either real shared ancestry or something like a shared conception or a shared myth of shared ancestry. So the myth doesn't necessarily have to be true, but the ethnic conception of nationhood has something to do with the narrative, at least about shared ancestry. A related conception is cultural. So the members of a nation share certain cultural characteristics typically, but not necessarily. These would include a shared language, a shared religion, a shared sense of historical destiny. And of course, there are mixtures of these two. So an ethnocultural conception would draw both on ethnic and cultural components, and somewhat less, I should mention the civic conception. That's a very prominent conception of nationhood, according to which nationhood is a kind of political idea. So the members of a nation share a kind of commitment to certain political ideas, and maybe somewhat less prominent accounts include territorial, economic, and voluntaristic accounts of nationhood. So I'm not even pretending that this is exhaustive. There isn't anywhere near an agreement in political philosophy about what a nation is. So this diversity of seemingly incompatible views is partly the reason why many political philosophers basically gave up on trying to say what a nation is, or fell back on this purely normative conception that I mentioned by David Miller. So the various ways, and this is going to be the starting point of the metaphysical account that I'm going to offer. So So there are all these rival conceptions of the nation, and there are different ways to try to adjudicate this very broad, very far-ranging disagreement about what a nation is. So this is going to be the starting point of the positive view that I'm going to sketch. So one way you could react to it is to accept something like monism. So this is my terminology. I should mention that. So the views that I'm going to mention, I'm going to call them monism and pluralism, but they go by lots of different names in the literature. I think these names are pretty descriptive for the thesis that I have in mind. But they have been called other things too. So according to monism, as I'm going to call it, at most one of these notions that I mentioned here captures what a nation really is, so to speak. So at most one of these conceptions can be right: ethnic, cultural, ethnocultural, civic, or some of the others. And accordingly, the other conceptions of nationhood are wrong, according to these pictures. So this would imply that if, for example, the civic conception of nation is correct, then people, nationalists or collectives with some kind of a national ambition with an ethnocultural self-conception are just confused, or they are just wrong about what kinds of collection they are members of. Conversely, if the ethnocultural conception is right, then nations with a civic self-conception are just wrong about what kind of collective they are. So that would be the monist view. It's pretty ruthless. So the obvious problem or apparent problem with a monist view is that different bona fide nations just seem to adopt clearly very different self-conceptions. So even the examples that I mentioned exemplify this. So it's fair to say, without being an expert in political science, I think it's fair to say that a civic or political self-conception is much closer to the American self-conception of the nation. cultural elements are much more dominant in European nationalisms. Ethnocultural ones are again more dominant in the Middle East and many Far Eastern countries. So it just seems very weird to say that only one of these conceptions is correct, and that for that reason, many collectives are just confused about the kind of collectives that they are, if they are a nation at all. So a very natural response to this phenomenon is what I call pluralism. So again, as I said, it goes by different names. Paul Gilbert calls it nominalism. So according to the view I'm calling pluralism, no single conception of nationhood applies to all states. So nations are self-styled according to this view, the way Gilbert puts it, which basically means that different collectives just get to choose their own self-conception. So there might be civic nations, which conceive of themselves according to civic criteria, but there might also be ethnocultural nations, and they are subject to ethnocultural criteria of membership. And those are both nations, and we just shouldn't demand that every nation have the same membership criteria. So this, on the face of it, this is attractive. I take it that this is much more, on the face of it at least, it looks much more intuitive than the monist view. But there are quite a few problems with it. So some of these problems have been pointed out by Paul Gilbert, so to a great extent I'm relying on them. So one obvious problem with the pluralist view is that competing self-definitions can be inconsistent. So it can easily happen that not just different collectives define themselves in different way, but the different members of the same collective conceive of membership in the nation in different ways. So, some members of the Romanian nation might have an ethnocultural self-conception, others might have a civic self-conception, and the pluralist view doesn't really say anything about which one of them, if any of them, is correct. So that's one problem. Another problem, perhaps an even more serious one, is that the pluralist view threatens to overgenerate competing claims to statehood. So this is not something I argued for, but it's pretty common to assume in philosophical defenses of nationalism that the presumptive right to self-determination basically manifests in a legitimate claim to statehood, to having an independent state. So one problem with this let every flower bloom self-conception is that it seems to overgenerate this claim. So just to give you an example, Catalonians have some sort of an independence ambition. It pops up in the news every few years. Catalonians would like, or at least some Catalonians would like, independence. So assuming that they have this presumptive right to independence, which collection of people is the one that possesses this right? And it looks like different criteria yield different collections. So one criterion would yield the residents of the region of Catalonia possess this right. Another criterion would say people of Catalonian ancestry are the possessors of this right. A third one would say people who share and maintain Catalonian culture and language are the ones who possess this right. The fourth one would say people who consider the Catalonian national cause their own cause. This would be closest to something like a civic conception, possess this right. And the obvious problem is that it can't possibly be that all of these collections have the right to self-determination because they overlap too closely. It's impossible for all of these four groups that I just mentioned to realize their right to self-determination because that would result in four very nearly overlapping countries. And of course, one of the basic criteria of national sovereignty is a sort of exclusiveness. So it's incompatible with the existence of a sovereign state to share its territory with large chunks of its territory with other sovereign states. So that's another problem with the pluralist view. The third problem, somewhat related to the second one, is that the pluralist view would seem to make many disputes between rival nationalisms verbal. So I'm going to give an example that comes from Paul Gilbert. So Gilbert notes the dispute between Ulster Protestants and Irish nationalists. It seems like at least part of the dispute between them stems from different conceptions of Irish nationhood, or just different disagreement about the boundaries of the Irish and the British nation. And of course, where Ulster Protestants belong in this debate. And the problem is that, of course, it sounds good to say that we should just let every flower bloom. We should let different nations set their own criteria of membership differently. But this doesn't really help us to get any traction on this particular debate, this particular dispute, and many similar ones. Because part of what's at issue in this debate is exactly where Ulster Protestants belong. Where Ulster Protestants belong in this national dispute, the dispute between competing nationalisms between the Irish and the British. So the pluralist view sounds nice, but it seems to be treating a debate verbal, even though in that debate a lot is at stake. It's not a dispute that intuitively should be verbal. So just to summarize where we are now, the monist view, according to which exactly one conception of the nation can be right, just seems very unintuitive on the face of it. The pluralist view seems much more intuitive, but it also has these apparently very serious problems. So how can we get out of this puzzle? How can we settle, or how can we progress with this debate between pluralists and monists? So what I'm going to suggest is a kind of moderate pluralist view of nations, or I'm going to call this a plenitude compromise, a plenitude pluralist account of nations. It goes roughly as follows. So I think of nations as four-dimensional groups of individual persons. And at least for the present purposes, I'm neutral about what a group is. I'm actually quite sympathetic to this extremely minimal conception recently defended by Isaac Wilhelm, that a group is simply just a plurality of persons. But I'm not really committed to this. A group might be a set, a fusion, or just a sui generis thing, an entirely different kind of thing altogether. But it is important for much of what I'm going to say that national collectives are four-dimensional. So they persist by way of having temporal parts. So what makes the view that I'm defending a plenitude view? So the way I think of it, wherever there's a nation, there's a huge number of closely overlapping other groups, which are intrinsically not very different from those nations. So when we look at a set of people, and we are trying to determine the boundaries of the nation, the presumptive nation that they make up in their vicinity, what we are going to see is that there are going to be a lot of people in that vicinity who are determinately members of the presumptive nation. There are going to be other people who are determinately aren't members of the presumptive nation. There are going to be some people who are borderline cases. So basically they are members according to, as I put it, some, but not all precisifications of the boundaries of this nation. I'm going to give a more detailed example, but never mind. I'm not going to give a coarse-grained example. I'm going to give a more detailed example immediately. So for now, to just proceed with this sketch, on this plenitude pluralist view that I would like to advocate for, we determine the group that is the best candidate for being identical to the nation on the basis of the we attitudes entertained by the candidate members that are at least members of the presumptive nation according to some specifications of the membership criteria. And basically the group that comes out as the best candidate reference of these attitudes is going to be the group that we should identify with the nation in question. So I used to defend the view, not just used to, I still hold that view, but I hold the view about personal identity that is structurally very similar. Actually, much of the unintuitiveness that accommodates this view in the case of personal identity, I think completely goes away in the case of nations. So in a way, the view that I originally developed for personal identity is much more plausible about national collectives. I should also note that the view that I'm developing, I see it as a much more detailed version of what Yael Tamir calls a cluster concept view of nationhood. So Tamir's basic idea is that we shouldn't pick any of the monist views, but each nation should satisfy some of the criteria that we would normally associate with cultural, ethnic, civic, and so on, conceptions of nationhood. So let me give you an example of how this view works. It's much easier to see, I think, much easier to see the attraction of this view through an example. So that's totally hypothetical example. I didn't conduct a survey. I just made up these numbers. So what does the words the Greek nation refer to? Who are Greeks? So in this hypothetical example, let's suppose that we have three competing self-conceptions. Let's say, again, totally arbitrary choices. Let's say a voluntaristic, a cultural, and a civic conception. And let's say that the number of candidate Greeks, according to all of these conceptions taken together, is 30 million people. Let's assume, moreover, that of these 30 million people, 7 million use the word Greek to refer to people who are Greek in the voluntaristic sense. Let's say that 9 million people use it for Greeks in the civic sense, so people who share some kind of collective political ambition or some sense of civic duty to the Greek state, something like that. Let's assume that 11 million Greeks use it for Greeks in the cultural sense of nationhood. 11 million people of this presumptive nation use it for Greeks in the cultural sense. And of course, there's the question of how to determine these numbers, which I just made up. And I don't really have any rigorous, easy recipe for deciding that. But I think there are lots of helpful cues to determine these numbers or to help estimate these numbers, at least in principle. So we should ask questions such as, whom do candidate Greeks consider Greeks? Who are they disposed to recognize as also Greeks? Who are the people with whom they feel some sort of historical continuity? Who are the people to whom they feel a sense of obligation resulting from being members of the same national community? And so on, and so on, and so on. And the basic idea is that we aggregate these various attitudes, some of which are not necessarily easy to recognize or easy to assess, but in principle, it's possible to aggregate these attitudes and get a result. So in the hypothetical example that I just gave now, the result would be that Greeks are a nation in the cultural sense. So in this hypothetical example, this would be the national self-conception that wins, so to speak. What's really important to emphasize is that because this is a plenitude view, it's a very profligate ontology. Because this is a plenitude view, the groups that I referred to with Greeks index voluntaristic and Greeks index civic, those groups still exist. So the collection of people that would count as Greeks in the voluntaristic sense and the collection of people that would count as Greeks in the civic sense, those groups still exist. But according to the view that I'm sketching, they are not nations. And the only reason that they are not nations is that there's something in their vicinity which is a better candidate to be a nation. So this is something I'm going to return to. One nice thing, or at least if you like, connecting these, this modern metaphysical picture to classic texts in the literature on nationalism, then it's a nice thing. So one nice thing about this is that this way of deciding what the reference of a national demonym is gives at least some justice to Renan's famous claim that a nation is a daily plebiscite. So what Renan roughly meant is that when he said that a nation is a daily plebiscite, is that day by day, a nation decides collectively what kind of collective it is. Well, there are different ways to interpret this claim, but that's how I'm reading him. So there's a very, very literal sense, according to the picture I'm offering, in which Renan's famous claim is true. A nation decides on a daily basis who belongs to that nation and who doesn't. This is determined by the collective attitudes, the we attitudes shared by members of the presumptive nation. So there are a bunch of qualifications to make, given this plenitude ontology that I've been describing. So I see this as a sort of compromise between the monist and the pluralist view. It's a compromise because nationhood isn't completely up to every single member of a prospective nation. It's not exactly an let every flower bloom view. But it still allows that there are different types of nations, that there are ethnocultural and civic and voluntaristic and other kinds of nations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all monist view. But at the same time, not just anything goes. An individual person can be wrong about what kind of national collective it is that he or she belongs to. So there are a few more upshots of this view. One very important one, which I already alluded to, is that nationhood turns out to be an extrinsic property. So it means that if you take a nation, there is a possible world in which there is a group qualitatively indistinguishable from that nation. But in that possible world, this duplicate group just fails to be a nation. And the only reason it fails to be a nation is that it overlaps too much with another group that is a better candidate for being a nation. This is an upshot of my view. I don't consider it implausible. Just think about it. If the Greeks in the cultural sense are a nation, and you take a word in which exactly the same people in the same arrangement exist, but they are a subgroup among 80 million other people who are roughly the same. They're also Greeks in the same way or in the same sense. Then that 11 million member subplurality wouldn't constitute a nation. I think this is intuitive. The second upshot of the view. It's not an upshot. It's something that my view doesn't entail, but also doesn't rule out. My view allows for this, is that nationhood is also a contingent property. So a group could cease to be a nation without ceasing to exist altogether. It's actually somewhat hard to find an actual case of this, or at least an uncontroversial case. I would think that the most plausible cases are cases of national fission. So cases in which a national group divides into subgroups, and the subgroups become distinct enough such that the fusion of these subgroups no longer counts as a nation. So maybe the Slavs would be a good example. The ancient Romans described the Slavs as a distinctive coherent national group, but of course today there are various different Slavic nations. There's been a split. So this would be an example of a group that used to be a nation, and the group still exists, but it isn't a nation anymore. So I think that the view that I've been offering has the advantage of handling pretty well some of the problems that I mentioned. So one problem that I mentioned was this problem of inconsistent self-conceptions. So because this is a compromise view, unlike pure, completely laissez-faire pluralist views, the view that I've been sketching allows or basically necessitates in a very straightforward sense that certain members of a nation can very easily be wrong about what their nation is. They could just belong to a minority with respect to what the most widespread re-attitude is concerning the criteria of membership in their group. So in the case of these people, there could be members of a nation who just don't conceive of the nation under the conception most likely shared among their candidate members. And according to the view that I was sketching, these people are just wrong in these cases. They're just wrong about who are the other members of the nation is. So there are special cases of this problem which you might find especially pressing. So one problematic case is what you might call the problem of unwanted exclusion. So problem of unwanted exclusion is a case in which the members of a smaller group believe that they are members of a certain nation, but the best candidate reference of all these aggregated candidate B members just doesn't include that group. So to give you a concrete examples, close to home, Black Hebrew Israelites consider themselves Jews, but other Jews don't consider them Jews. So they think they are Jews, but no Jew who is not a Black Hebrew Israelite considers the Black Hebrew Israelites Jews. So you might think that this is troublesome, or even if this particular case you don't find troublesome, you can easily think of cases that seem problematic given this result. So what's my answer? My answer is pretty flat-footed in this case. My answer is that in these cases, the Bs, the members of this smaller group just aren't members of the major group in question. And here I would like to emphasize something that I said at the outset of this talk. My primary focus is not normative here. So it's as far as I can see, it's a separate question whether the members of the group of which the smaller group's members believe themselves to be members of, it's a further question whether other members of the larger group are criticizable for not making membership criteria more inclusive, for not having a more inclusive conception of nationhood. So, normatively, it's easily possible that they're criticizable for this. I think this is something to be checked on a case-by-case basis, but this doesn't change the actual facts of membership. If you think you belong to a group, but most members of that group don't think you belong to that group, then you don't belong to that group. At least that's the case. That's the case in the case of nations, which might be a bad thing, but it remains the case. So there's actually a mirror image of the problem I just mentioned. So this was the member of unwanted exclusion. A somewhat less obvious, but possibly also serious problem is the problem of unwanted inclusion. So it also seems possible, given the picture that I sketched, that members of a smaller group A believe that they are not members of a certain nation, but the best candidate reference of all the candidate B members does include those people. So I'm never completely sure what's the best example of a certain problem. Turkish Kurds might be an example. So I'm actually not, again, I haven't made a survey. This is a hypothetical example, but it's quite possible that most Turkish Kurds don't consider themselves Turks. Other Turks might well consider them might well consider them Turks though. At least if the Turkish constitution is anything to go by, the Turkish constitution defines someone as a Turk who is bound to Turkey via the tie of citizenship. So by that criterion, Turkish Kurds would be Turks. But it's quite possible that they themselves don't think they are Turks. So again, question, isn't this a problem? So one thing to say is that this sort of case might be somewhat less common than it seems at first sight, because I think that this kind of case is easily confused with cases in which the B members don't necessarily oppose their membership in the larger group, but they also maintain their distinctiveness as a nation within that larger group, which is something that might be institutionally or socially discouraged by the members of the group, the larger group. So this is something I'm going to get back to in a few minutes. But the main point is that the account doesn't rule out nested nations. So nested nations are nations that are subgroups within a larger nation. And it seems like what really matters, and this is basically the second answer, it seems like what really matters from a normative point of view is whether the presumptive members of a larger nation, the subgroup within a larger nation, also itself constitutes a nation. If it itself constitutes a nation, then at least in a political philosophy context or in the context of philosophical justifications of nationalism, they would possess the rights that are normally ascribed to nations. So in the case of the Turkish Kurds, it doesn't really seem to matter whether they are Turks. What seems to matter is whether they themselves constitute a nation within this nation. This is what seems to matter. So it's not such a big intuitive cost if it turns out that they belong to a larger nation that they themselves don't think that they belong to, as long as they also constitute a smaller nation within that larger nation. So here's the second problem, which I mentioned, I cited from Paul Gilbert. This is the overgeneration problem. So as I noted, the pluralist view threatens to overgenerate competing claims to nationhood and therefore collective claims to national self-determination. So given this plenitude pluralist view that I sketched, the mechanism by which collective self-reference is determined actually ensures that there can't possibly be several largely overlapping nations. And again, this is because when you take any set of largely overlapping candidates, which compete to be the referent of the same national domain, only the best candidate gets to be a true referent. Only the best candidate counts as a nation. So the other candidates, as I noted, they still exist. Those groups are real groups. I'm not sure if they count as social groups, but they're groups, the collections of people. But they don't count as nations because they are not as good referents as the best candidate referent. So there are lots of overlapping nation-like entities intrinsically suitable to be nations, but most of them aren't nations. So there isn't this issue with too many nations in the same place at the same time. So I should note that the account I sketched still allows for some genuine referential indeterminacy about national membership, but I think this is probably a relatively rare phenomenon, and it doesn't generate the sort of big problem that Paul Gilbert warned against. So the third problem that I mentioned, which I illuminate, I borrowed this example from Paul Gilbert, but which I illuminated through the case of Ulster Protestants, is the trivialization, this trivialization of competing national boundaries. So take against the Ulster Protestants. Suppose most Brits think that the Ulster Protestants are British. Suppose most Irish people think that the Ulster Protestants are Irish. Given the account that I just sketched, you might worry that instead of the trivialization problem, there's just an overly simple way of settling the disputes. You might worry that, well, the Brits are much more numerous than the Irish. So it looks like they just automatically win out when we are trying to fix the reference of national demonyms in these shared we attitudes in national context. So isn't this a problem? So my answer is I don't think it's a problem. At least I don't think it's a big problem. The Brits can, of course, decide due to their overwhelming numbers compared to the relatively small number of Ulster Protestants that the Ulster Protestants are Brits. They have no say, however, in whether Ulster Protestants are also Irish. That's something that is up to candidate members of the Irish nation to determine, which again also includes Ulster Protestants because they would count as Irish, at least according to some precisifications of the word Irish. So this is also something to note. As I said, there can't be different nations with a large overlap. Okay, so there can't be nations with almost entirely overlapping members, but it could be different nations with some overlap. I take it that this is also a perfectly intuitive consequence of the view I'm developing. It's perfectly possible for a person to have hyphenated national identities and to belong to different nations, more than one different nation at the same time. So there could be small overlap between nations. There can't be huge overlap. There can't be an 80% overlap. Okay, so I just mentioned, this is just noting some further consequences of the view. So I just mentioned that a person can belong to more than one nation. Overlap could possibly be ruled out in specific cases. So it's possible that a nation has a self-conception that rules out membership in another nation. So this would be plausibly the case when relations between two different nations have been historically extremely hostile. This is probably not very common, but it's possible. Something else I also alluded to is that my account allows for nested nations. So a nested nation would be a case in which every member of a nation is also a member of another nation, but not vice versa. So Scots might be an example of a nested nation. Catalans and the Quebecois might be further examples. So again, my account doesn't entail that they are nested nations, but it also doesn't rule it out. I think this is a good thing. As far as I can see, the mainstream view in political philosophy is that nested nations exist. So I'm coming very close to the end, but I want to note kind of a fun and interesting consequence of the view that I've been sketching. So in nationalist rhetorics, and this was especially common in late 19th century national movements, it was very common to talk about slumber. So nationalist thinkers very often describe the past of their nations as a kind of slumber when the national collective already existed but wasn't aware of itself or didn't yet form fully fledged political ambitions. So this picture, this notion of slumber is something that serious scholars of nationalism love to make fun of. So there's this famous quotation from Ernst Gellner: nationalism is not the awakening of an old latent dormant force. So that is how it does indeed present itself. It is in reality the consequence of a new form of social organization based on deeply internalized education-dependent high cultures, each protected by its own state. It uses some of the pre-existent cultures, generally transforming them in the process, but it cannot possibly use them all. There are too many of them. Apologies for the typo. But the basic point is that it's very common in the self-conception of nations to speak of slumber, basically this historical stage when the nation already existed, but didn't yet have collective ambitions. And this is something that it's often part of the popular conception, but not the sort of thing that scholars typically take seriously. So one thing that I want to point out is that given this brand of pluralism that I've been sketching, this reasoning of Ganner doesn't hold. It's actually, my view actually is able to make perfect sense of slumber, collective slumber before awakening as a stage in the history of a nation. So basically, the slumber period could be just defined as a period in the history of a nation when the nation already existed, but didn't yet have the collective property of being a nation, because it didn't possess some of the criteria of nationhood, or it just didn't have the sorts of ambitions that come with nationalist movements. So what Ganner, I think, is right about is that most social groups that could have been nations just aren't nations. You could say that those social groups remain in slumber forever. But it doesn't follow that before a nation was a nation, it didn't exist, because my view allows for nation to be a contingent property. My view also allows, and I think this is a good thing, it also allows for nations that change with respect to what kind of nation they are. Here, my view importantly relies on this assumption that nations are four-dimensional entities. So they exist, they persist over time by virtue of having temporal parts at those different times. So what does it take for a nation to turn from one kind of nation into another kind? So for example, what does it take for a nation to turn from an ethnocultural nation into a civic nation? Well, on the view that I've been sketching, the way this can happen is that a nation has a temporal part at a certain time. That temporal part is the best candidate referent of a demonym and obeys ethnocultural criteria of nationhood. Its members obey ethnocultural members of nationhood. And this four-dimensional nation also has a temporal part at a later time, which is a best candidate reference of the same national demonym at that time. But at that time, the demonym picks out something that is a nation only in the civic sense. So this is perfectly possible, given the sort of view that I've been sketching. In this case, you just have a four-dimensional worm that is the nation over time, with an ethnocultural and the civic temporal part. So it's worth noting that a worm that is ethnocultural through and through at every stage of its existence might still very well exist. It's just not a nation, according to the view that I've been sketching. And likewise, another temporal worm that is a civic nation could also exist, but it's not a nation, according to the view that I've been sketching. The only nation in this case is something with an ethnocultural and later a civic temporal part. So again, I think this is a good thing. I think it's intuitive that nations sometimes change. Sometimes a nation changes from an ethnoculturally conceived nation into a civic one. The reverse can also happen. And this metaphysics that I sketched can make sense of this phenomenon. And yeah, that's basically it. So I'm curious about any questions you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, David. This has been quite thought-provoking and amazing. So thanks. Please join me in thanking Dr. Kovacs with a heartfelt round of virtual applause. David, I just wanted to make sure, do you hear us well? All good?
Yeah.
Excellent. And I wonder, I've got a couple of questions of my own, but I don't want to use my privilege as a chair. So I wonder if there are any other questions. If you could raise your virtual hand, or if you could make yourselves known in chat. We have a question from Dan Zeman. Hi, Dan, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. So I think I'm a bit puzzled by the example you gave with the Greeks. I mean, this probably leads nowhere, but I just want to ask something, probably something very confused. So, I mean, but if I understand the case correctly, you said it's like, okay, there's this 13 million people that are the candidates to being part of the nation of the Greeks. And then, you mentioned these three ways in which from those people, whatever numbers consider themselves as Greeks, then as being part of the nation of Greeks, but like in different understandings, right? And I'm just curious about, like, is there a concept that corresponds to, so how did you, like, I don't even know how to put this, but like, is there a concept that corresponds to the 13 million? And if so, shouldn't that be on the table? And if so, again, could that be the notion of nation that you're like looking for? What's the, I think like, I'm not, basically the question is like, what's the status of the corresponding concept of the 30 million? And if it could be the nation that you're looking for.
So,
does it make any sense?
No, I think I understand your question. Yeah. So it depends on the case. So in the case, as I imagined it, there isn't a fourth conception corresponding to the 30 million, corresponding to the 30 million people. It's possible, of course, that there is a fourth conception, which is disjunctive in this sense. So it's possible in principle that there is a fourth conception which says that, you're Greek if either you're ethnoculturally Greek or you're Greek in the civic sense, or you're Greek in this some kind of third sense. And it's also possible, it's perfectly possible that it's this disjunctive criterion that is actually accepted by the greatest number of candidate members. This is possible. It is not the case in the hypothetical example that I imagined. So in the hypothetical example that I imagined, this most, so to speak, most liberal, most disjunctive conception that would include all 30 million members couldn't possibly win. But it's possible for there to be another case in which something like that does win. I'm not sure how satisfying that is. Yeah.
No, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I understand. That I understand. I was wondering, maybe there's like, I mean, you picked up those 13 million. How did you do that? 13, right? How did you do that? Is there a, like, is your notion, what kind of notion is that? Could it be a notion of nation? Well, if yes, why isn't that on the table? I mean, I understand by the design of the case that like the people don't have this notion, but like maybe they should have it, right? I mean, maybe it should be on the table because you're using it, certainly. Because you, the person who designs the case, is that the notion of nation? I'm not sure, but like should.
I mean, it's I wouldn't say that that's a notion of a nation. I mean, I think that's a very general. I think that's really just a very general thing about precisifications and referential indeterminacy. So when you have a referentially indeterminate concept and it has somewhat overlapping candidates, suppose you have a referentially indeterminate concept and it has these overlapping, largely overlapping, but not coincident candidate extensions. I don't think it's generally plausible that the sum of those extensions is also a candidate extension of the concept. So just to take a very simple case, what counts as green? I'm not sure that's the best example, but what counts as green? You could imagine some a very fine-grained color scale, and it ranges from these very I don't exactly know how to, set up the color
yeah.
scheme, but presumably it would have like different scales of different ranges of shades that you could identify with green. I don't think it's plausible that automatically the best candidate extension for green is just the most permissive, this like set of all the candidates ranges that you could understand by green. I think that's actually less plausible than any of the individual ranges, if that makes sense. So I think this is just a very general issue about vagueness, that I don't think that the suggestion, as I understand, is that this most permissive conception that just lumps together all these candidate extension, that itself is a candidate extension. I don't find that plausible generally.
Can I have one more try, Andre? And sorry, Asya.
If it's very quick, by all means, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, question for you, David. How did you how are you picking up these 13 million that are candidates for the nation of Greece, for the Greek nation?
So that's a good question.
I mean, that's right.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer. So to be frank, I don't really have an answer. So
because they have to be somehow connected to the nation of Greece, to the Greek nation, right? So I'm thinking maybe someone lurking in your identifying those 13 million as potential candidates. There is some notion that might play some role.
That's true. So that is true. So that is true. So I do start off with some kind of an intuition about what's even a remotely plausible candidate for being a member of the nation.
Yeah.
And I can't really give you some kind of an independent ground on which to justify that choice.
Because whatever that notion is, that maybe might be one of the candidate notions. That was my whole point.
So again, I'm not sure, because that notion. So that the sum of all those candidate notions, that would include members that literally have nothing in common. So I think that's what I would like to. So that notion would have members which don't have a shared culture, don't have a shared self-conception, don't have a shared civic duty, do not have a shared language, nothing, because they just all you could pick two members that just satisfy different presumptive criteria, but don't satisfy any shared one. So maybe other people have different intuitions, but I would say that I would say that's not a nation, or that's not a strong enough candidate to be a nation.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, and sorry for keeping so long.
No, not at all. This is fascinating. So
this was interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much, Don, for the question, and David for answering. Next up, we have a question from Asya Pasinski. Asya, thanks so much for your patience, and please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, no problem at all. That was a really interesting exchange. So actually, now I have a kind of a thought on the previous exchange. So I thought maybe I can start with that and then move to my question. So, I mean, I was thinking that one thing that you could say, David, maybe is that the way that you identify kind of the initial 30 million, whatever members of the Greek nation, I mean, it's something like paradigm instances, right? So oftentimes in philosophy, when we're theorizing about some phenomenon, like we identify paradigm instances of knowledge and then say, well, that's the phenomenon we're coming up with a theory of. So I feel like that route is also open to you. And you can say, well, okay, take the American nation. There are many paradigm instances of members of the American nation. These are all uncontroversial cases. And it's those people that you initially look at, and you look at what criteria they have for being a member of the American nation. And then more people get to be included depending on their criteria. But I guess that seems to me like a plausible kind of response for you. And yeah, a method that seems to be generally used in philosophical theorizing.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. And thanks, by the way, for checking in. Thanks. So yeah, I might as well take that. So maybe the one thing I would add, and this kind of complements what I said in response to Dan, is that the starting point could be paradigm instances. Then I would say any candidate extension of a national collective, of a national demonym, that would be a set of people that include the paradigm instances and people who resemble the paradigm instances according to some plausible seeming criteria of membership. And of course, because resemblance is not transitive, all of the people who resemble the paradigm instances might not resemble each other at all. So yeah, that's helpful. I might as well just take that. Thanks.
Cool. So then I have many other questions. So I guess I'll start with my just clarification question. So I really like the idea that you have that it's like the putative members that get to decide on the criteria. So that seems super plausible to me. And I'm wondering whether you're thinking of that as like a thesis in metaphysics. So is this like part of the metaphysics of nations for you that say maybe, I don't know if you're a fan of essence, but like someone who likes essence or real definition might say, well, it just like lies in the nature of nationhood that the putative members of a nation get to kind of decide who's in that nation, roughly. So that would be kind of part of the metaphysics of nations versus a different kind of option. I don't know if they're mutually exclusive, but at least another option would be to say, no, this is a thesis about the referent of these national, how do you call them, demonyms? the nation, the nation terms, I'll call them. I can't pronounce that word. So then it would be a thesis
I don't think
about,
I can pronounce it either.
Yeah, so that would be like more of a philosophy of language thesis about how reference works in the case of these terms, that like the way that the reference there gets fixed is this whole story that you're telling about what the putative members take to be the criteria, right? And so, yeah, it wasn't entirely clear to me because sometimes it seemed to me that you were talking as if it's like more a metaphysical thesis, and then sometimes it sounded like you were talking about it more as this thesis about language. So I was curious kind of how you were thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for that. So it's definitely the latter picture. So I didn't mean to say anything about real definition or essence. My views about essence are extremely old school, pre-Feinian. I'm a modalist about essence. I don't believe in any kind of essence other than just necessary properties. I mean, you could, I think, as far as I can see, you could put that spin on the view, and I don't see any immediate incompatibility. I still wouldn't say that this is just a thesis in the philosophy of language, because the referential story that I'm giving still demands a plenitude ontology. The story couldn't work without that plenitude ontology. So it does have an ontological component, but the ontological component is very simple and minimalistic. You just have this plenitude of groups, which I'm even inclined to think are just plenitudes of pluralities. These are just pluralities, and you could give a counterpart theoretic treatment of their modal properties, but you don't need to go that far. So the ontological part is extremely simple and desert landscape. But it comes with this story about reference determination. So it's more like the latter kind of thing that I had in mind.
I see. Cool. So then you probably wouldn't put your view as like, you're giving us a story about like what nations really are. You're rather saying, look, the world contains all these groups, and then we have these terms in our language like American nation, and then you're linking up this plenitudinous ontology of groups with like those terms in our language and saying, well, it latches on to the best fit one.
I mean, I see where you're coming from when you say that I'm not giving a story about what nations really are, but I would like to insist that I am giving a story about what nations really are. I just said so. There's nothing more to it. I see the view as a view about what nations really are, but it's of course an extremely deflationary view about the significance of this qualifier really. There's nothing.
Right.
I said what nations are, so I said what nations really are. There's nothing more to seek. That's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, I see. And so that would be similar for like your analogous view. You said you have a somewhat analogous view for persons. So that would just be kind of across the board. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Great. That's very helpful.
Thanks for the question.
I have more questions if people, but other people should speak first.
So thanks so much, Asya. I think I'll ask a quick question of my own, and then we'll start a new round, and you guys can pinpoint David to some of his commitments. My question came in sort of fairly early on, right? So you offered your own view about what nations are, or perhaps how we should identify what the reference of the term nation are in the world. Perhaps you want to see them as the same, or anyway. So you offered that view as a view that solves a problem for pluralism, right? And
Yeah.
early on, and I had a question about one of your first slides, I think, about exactly how pluralism gets defined, right?
Okay, let me.
Yeah.
I'm going to start going, and stop me when appropriate.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's this slide. Okay.
This.
So there was a slide where you're talking about pluralism. Yes, here it is. This one, the natural response, right? No single conception of nationhood applies to all states. Nation are self-styled, right? So from the way you put it, and perhaps this wasn't a commitment that you had, but from the way you put it, it sounded as though when you say nations are self-styled, it can't be the case that you have one and the same nation, okay? And different folks conceive of it differently. So, and this ties into some of the examples with conflicting or inconsistent nation ascriptions that you had later on. So I'm thinking of, well, anyway, the example that sprang to mind to me was the religious civil war between the Huguenots and the Catholics in the 17th century. So you start in the 16th century, actually, and then there's a bit of an aftermath in the 17th century. You start with the Huguenots being sort of on the defensive, but then Henry IV becomes king, and you have the Edict of Nantes, where Huguenots are granted. These are Reformed rather than Catholic Frenchmen. Okay. And they took refuge in the Kingdom of Navarre, but then that was aligned to France when Henry IV became king. And then you have the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. So you have 1598, 1685, right? And what Fontainebleau does is reverse Nantes, right? And so the right to worship freely in their non-Catholic right was revoked. The right to, anyway, other kinds of rights and protections were, anyway. So you have these competing views of what the French nation is. You have a view, the view that Huguenots seem to share, on which this is very much not tied to Catholicism. And you had the view supported by the de Guise and by the House of Lorraine, whereby being Catholic was essential to being French, right? And so it seems as though in the third person, I'd be inclined to say that there's a stark separation between church and state. And so from that standpoint, even however anachronistic, it seems the Huguenots seem to have been right in this particular respect. But it seems as though you had people with conflicting intuitions about what the French nation is, that were nonetheless negotiating this and fighting over this in quite a bloodthirsty way within the French nation. And you want to say it's one and the same French nation.
I do. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I wonder why would you want to style pluralism in this? It seemed as though somehow the nation comes together and produces its own conception of nationhood or something like that, whereas you could have conflicting factions within the nation, right? And these conflicting factions could have different views of what the nation is, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just trying. So I'm just trying to. Let me try to make sure that
Yes.
I understood. That I understood the question. So I take it that what you are taking issue with is just this laissez-faire characterization of pluralism when, well, the Huguenot, something like, it's almost like a kind of relativism, right? The Huguenots are right from their point of view, the Catholics are right from their point of view. I take it part of your complaint is that's just very implausible from the outset. A more plausible view of pluralism would be more restricted from the get-go, and would say that these questions are in some sense up for negotiation, but it can't be right that all of those factions are somehow right. Is that it? Is that
right? So it seemed to me that there's a possibility that I thought should be allowed for, and it wasn't immediately clear to me that your view of what pluralism is allowed for it. Okay. And the possibility in question is whether one and the same nation could be conceived in different and perhaps antagonic way by factions that, notwithstanding, are part of that one and the same nation.
Okay, thanks. So that's helpful. So I think I'm trying to find the part where I very briefly mention something similar. Yeah, so this is basically the last paragraph here, which it was not even, it was a quarter sentence, but the answer is I was optimistically I'm going to start the sentence over. So I think in most cases the numbers are just going to decide these questions. So if the Huguenots are a relatively small minority and the Catholics are a great majority, and the Catholics overwhelmingly and clearly think that the Huguenots are not French, then in my view, the Huguenots are not French. Maybe, maybe that just shows that the Catholics are bigoted. So this is just a reminder that this is not a project. This is not a project in amelioration. It's a project in something closer to conceptual analysis. But that's what the linguistic facts would seem to dictate in that case. So the hope is that usually the numbers are overwhelming and decisive. It's perfectly possible that there are cases when that's just not true. So it's perfectly possible that there are cases when the different factions are roughly equally sized, sufficiently equally sized that there's no clear fact of the matter about the reference of the demonym that they are using. I think this is possible. I think when that's the case, the best thing, I was expressing the hope that this is rare. So if the numbers are right, in the case you mentioned, then this might be one of those cases. So in those cases, I think it's just genuinely indeterminate where the boundaries of a nation are. Maybe I should point out that given this plenitude precisification of view that I sketched out, this would just be a case of ordinary boring linguistic vagueness. So if you think that metaphysical vagueness in the word is bad, then this is demonstration that the view I'm sketching can avoid that. But such vagueness is definitely possible, and maybe the sort of case that you describe is just a case of genuine referential indeterminacy.
I see.
I would like to allow for that. If it turns out that this is really common, that's kind of bad. I would take that as a disadvantage of my view. I would hope that this is not super common, but it can definitely happen.
I see. Well, okay. Well, thanks for answering. And just really quickly. Okay. I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna ask my question later on. So, Asya, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, Andre, you can go, and then I can go after your follow-up.
Oh, okay. I have other questions too, but this was really quick connected to David, what you just said. So I might have missed this. Did you offer any argument for the number criterion? So for why numbers should win out? So why is it that the smaller group doesn't necessarily have a better view of what the nation that they belong to is than?
No, I didn't give any argument for that. I didn't give any
Okay.
argument for that.
Okay. Yeah. So good. So this was
I mean,
quick.
yeah, it's based on just, you know, it's based on somewhat naive intuitions to the effect that use facts determine semantic value. That's basically it. You know, the smaller group could get it right against the bigger group if one of the candidates was you know, a reference magnet, and the smaller group just discovered the national joints in nature. But I was assuming that there are no such national joints, or at least that when it comes to competing claims of nationhood, these competing candidates are roughly equally natural. So there's no magnetism at play here.
Okay. Well, thank you.
That's the background picture I was operating with. Yeah.
All right. Asya, please go ahead.
Cool. Well, now I again have a follow-up on this exchange now. So I'll maybe start with that again. So I wonder then if use facts for you are going to determine the reference, then I'm now a little bit worried about why like the use of that term by people who are not putative members of the nation like has absolutely no role, right? So then would you endorse some sort of like semantic deference thesis where in general
Yes.
you think that everyone semantically defers to the putative members?
Yeah, that's basically I'm definitely assuming something like that. So well, I should, because I'm explicitly assuming that in the case of personal identity. So the idea is that when interacting with groups of people who use a national demonym, your second person reference, you know, you Greeks, your purpose is to pick out the intended referent of the basically of the we attitudes that the putative Greeks are referring to. That's something I'm assuming. Well, to be clear, I haven't thought of this particular problem in this context, but given that this is exactly what I'm saying about the personal identity case, I guess I should say the same about the nation case. That when you're trying to refer in the second or third person sense to a national collective, your referential intention is to pick out the referent of the plural first person, referent of the plural first person attitudes expressed by the putative members of that nation.
Yeah, I see.
I probably should assume that, yeah, or maybe I must assume that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder where there are cases where, I don't know, like outsiders kind of impose it and don't defer. I don't know, gypsies, I don't know, that was one that came to mind. I don't know if that's a plausible case. Yeah, I don't know, but.
Yeah, I can so, you know, to be frank, I just said, this is not something I actually really thought of. I'm kind of just, I'm now just basically using the canned response that I have in the personal identity case. But I think you're definitely right that the national case could introduce special problems that don't arise with people. So that's probably that's something I should think more about. So thanks for that. That's a good point. That's something to think more about.
Yeah, I mean, especially in cases of like, I don't know, some group of people being oppressed, or, you know, oppressors coming in and like carving out an ethnic group. Yeah.
I mean, it depends. A lot depends on the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot depends on what the oppression consists in. Does it consist? I mean, I'm not very good at coming up with examples, but I would have assumed that invaders come in. It's not like they particularly care. I mean, yeah, I need to think more about this, but yeah, I guess it can easily happen that an invader conquers a territory and treats different subgroups within the same national collective very differently, even though before they came, it's not like they treated each other differently. So, but on the other hand, those kinds of historical events do in the long run lead to new recordings of national collectives. So yeah, I don't have a determinate answer. That's just probably a complication that I need to think through. Thanks for that.
Cool. Can I now ask my question? Cool. So I was wondering kind of how essential this commitment to four-dimensionalism really is for you. So I was thinking that there's at least like one other sort of view that's a three-dimensionalist view that it seems to me kind of works for all of your purposes, which is like a Kit Fine style variable embodiment view.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
No,
because it seemed like
didn't want to cut you off. I should let you finish.
No. I mean, it just seemed to me that the only kind of point at which the four-dimensionalism like really became crucial was with the changing self-conception point. But then I think that like a finding variable embodiment account also allows for that sort of change.
I think that's totally right. I mean, I think in some ways that's that particular kind of three-dimensionalist view, I think wheels in a lot of machinery that I don't particularly want, or which I think is just much more complicated than a very simple temporal parts ontology. But I think generally speaking, it's not even the only alternative.
Right.
There are plenty of endurantist views which mimic very well the features of four-dimensionalism. So I think that's completely right. So I'm not strictly speaking committed to that. I think it's probably the simplest version of a set of, you could say, metaphysically equivalent pictures, at least for my present purposes, which would suit my purposes equally well. Excuse me. Yeah, I think that's completely right.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's like a virtue. I think that's a virtue of your view, because you can kind of pitch it as, you don't have to be a four-dimensionalist, like this is my preferred version, but like you can also be a three-dimensionalist. And as long as you endorse one of these options, like you can also be on board with my whole theory.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. I basically just took a shortcut because it's such a mouthful to just, I mean, it's also a presentation. I think it's just kind of difficult to circumscribe the exact set of views that's fit for the purpose that I'm having. But yeah, I think that's completely right. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Thanks so much, Asya, for the question, and David for answering. David, you've been subject to quite a battery of questions here. I have more.
Much appreciated.
I believe there are more in the audience as well, but I just wanted to tap in, and if at any point you feel that we've hammered you enough, just let us know, and we can adjourn and come back.
Don't spare me.
Okay.
Don't spare me.
So I'm not sure exactly if this. I'm not sure exactly how this ties into your talk, but I have a feeling it might somehow. Okay. So and I'm not even sure I get any of the historical record right. Okay, so this is going to be a partly imagined historical example. Okay, so I think we all remember when we say nation, right? We've all learned in our secondary school history classes that the age of nations was the 19th century. This kind of Michelet inspired historiography, right? Stuff like that. And we remember that Garibaldi was at the forefront of uniting the Italian nation. And there was this kind of sentiment of unity and belongingness, and everybody wanted to come together and so on, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, the way that German unification is sometimes portrayed and the birth of the German nation is that it was a kind of clever political negotiation to separate themselves under the bastion of Prussia against the Austrians, right? So there was this kind of, well, first they had this concept that it would be geopolitically better, despite the differences between Bavarians and Prussians and Saxons and so on, that it might just be better to unite under a nation, and there wasn't any kind of deeply felt feeling of belongingness there, right?
Yeah.
Just this idea that, look, opportunity knocks, and maybe that's better to separate from the Austrian Empire. Well, Napoleon helped with that a bit as well. But anyway, so it seems as though the way that these different nations sort of came about, to the extent that you want the word nation to resemble something like the creation of national states like Italy and Germany and so on. The way that this conception of a nation came about is incredibly different in the two cases.
Yeah.
And well, in my fancied history, maybe it's all imaginary, but anyway. So does this do anything for what you've put forward here? Is it an example in your favor? Is it against something you've said? Or does the fact that say Bavarians and Prussians felt they had very little together, does that to share and so on, does that imply they weren't a part of the German nation? Or so I just wonder if the example does anything with respect to your view.
Yeah, cool question. So first of all, I'm much less well versed in history than you, but what you described is also exactly what I learned in high school. So the history part seems right to me, as far as I can tell. So does it do anything to my account? So I want to say two things. So the first thing is, I think on the face of it, at least the letter of my account as I stated it, I think is consistent with this case, because it doesn't exactly demand that all members of a nation need to feel this sense of communal duty toward one another. I mean, all the more, I mean, an even less sophisticated example is just, a lot of people just don't care about their own national memberships. A lot of people just don't, it's fashionable to speak of the post-national era. A lot of people just don't care. So when you consider these we attitudes, I have in mind something much more permissive, as much less demanding than, actually feeling that you have a lot together with other members of the same nation. It's this hodgepodge of various criteria, which I openly admit I didn't state in a great amount of detail, but it could include shared language, some sort of shared sense of history, which might not go very deep. Anyway, so that's the first claim, that it's not. I really don't want to demand that various members of the same nation must feel some deep sense of common belonging in order to be. No, that would already be a very particular conception of nationality. The whole point of this pluralist view that I was sketching is to avoid committing myself to something so specific. So that's one thing. The other thing, and this is something that I just completely glozed over, because it's a complication that I just need to think more about later as I develop the account. I think the German case also points to something really interesting, which just completely complicates the account, which is what to do with national self-conceptions that at least initially are top-down, basically some kind of a ruling elite or ruling class, or even just one monarch or a small number of monarchs just imposes on the people in a top-down way. What to say about those cases? So I think that these examples just point to the need to just really complicate the conception that I sketched out initially. So Asya prodded me a little bit about semantic deference. So another kind of semantic deference, I think a fully fledged, like basically a more sophisticated version of my view should allow for, is semantic deference to, in the direction of rulers or monarchs. So that would be something like some sort of a semantic, even if the subjects of a non-democratic regime don't particularly have national sentiments, they might have some sort of deference to the monarch, or they might grant political legitimacy to the monarch, including the determination of national membership according to the monarch. I hope this wasn't super unclear, but the basic point is, I do want to allow for that kind of semantic deference too, which we don't think of it that much these days, because in the context of nationalism, the political philosophy literature on nationalism, we usually think of democratic nation states, but that's definitely something that I want to at least grant conceptual space for, and which wasn't present in the account as I stated it. So that's something I want to work on. I just haven't figured out yet how to incorporate that into the account, but it's a very good example for that.
All right, thanks so much. And Asya, the floor is yours.
Yeah, that's just on this point. So I'm thinking another possible way for you to go maybe would be to say that the rulers can, in certain situations, cause people to then adopt certain attitudes, right? Through mechanisms like social pressure and propaganda and that sort of thing. And I think that would maybe be especially plausible if the relevant attitude on the part of the people is not just like what criteria they kind of believe, but something a little bit more practical, right? So like in the social ontology literature, oftentimes people talk about acceptance or recognition, or like these attitudes that are meant to be something in between like belief and behavior. I mean, it's not always clear what this is supposed to be, but if it's something like that, then it seems like maybe what the rulers are doing is they're just, causally influencing people's relevant attitudes in a certain way in those cases.
Right. So I think that's definitely part of what's going on. Whether that's enough for me to say depends on how intuitive you think it is to say that already at the time of German unification, there was such a thing as the German nation, and it included both Prussians and Bavarians. If you think it didn't, then this causa story will be enough. If you want to say that, no, there was already such a thing as a German nation, even if it wasn't as fully forged as it is now, then I think something more. Then I think you need to go in for something more than a purely causal conception. Personally, my intuition is that there was such a thing at a time as a German nation. There were Germans. There already were Germans. So for me, that's probably not strong. That's probably not strong enough, but it's definitely part of what's going on.
Cool. I mean, maybe, well, this would be a really, I guess, radical view, but saying there could be like retroactive, some sort of retroactive thing going on where like the attitudes at the later point are kind of projected back in time. And that's why it was true even earlier to say that there was that nation, but probably you don't want to go that route.
Well, I should. So again, I'm referring back to something that I did say about personal identity, and I said pretty much that in the personal identity case about puzzle cases. Okay. So it is, but that's not necessarily the most intuitive consequence of. I mean, it's not a consequence. It's just it's an option. Right. It is possible that at a certain time t. It's forced to say that these people belong to the same nation, and it's possible that at a later time it's going to be true to say those two people were members of the same nation at time t. So that's a possibility. That's a possibility. Yeah.
You might even think that even at the time T, it's true, but it's true in virtue of future facts.
Well, so
But
that's actually one part where the choice between pluralism and these three-dimensional views might be relevant, because if you're a pluralist, then in any case you're quite pressed to going for something like this temporal externalist view that the reference of singular terms is at a time might partly be determined by facts in the future. So in a way, you know, if you don't think that's horrible, then you know, going in for the pluralist version of the view might even land in some kind of, I don't know, a nice, aesthetically speaking, a nice kind of consistency. I'm happy with that, but some might consider that, right, you know, a pill to swallow.
Cool.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks.
And I'd have a quick follow-up to Asia's question, and I think I want to connect that with an earlier question she asked, and it's about the semantics v metaphysics sort of issues. So I was wondering if the analogy with personal identity isn't sort of tilting the scales somehow, because it seems as though in the personal identity case, you want to have a kind of winner takes all view, right? You want to be able to identify, well, which one is it that's the person, right? The person, right? Whereas here, it would seem that if you have a bunch of overlapping partial criteria, you want to, in some sense, leave open the possibility that some more loosely fit and some more partial criteria are going to overlap in such a way that what might initially seem as the unique best candidate isn't in fact what's actually doing the work and supporting nationwide representations or something like that. So I was wondering whether there seems to be this kind of semantic story to what you're saying, right? The part where we simply disentangle what are the ways that the word nation is used in and its cognates, right? And then we're going to read that perhaps pragmatically or metasemantically, well, here's sort of the history of that, here's how different groups in that nation have used the word and have identified the nation with it, and so on. And then there's this kind of sharp metaphysics switch to winner takes all view between all those different criteria. And you say, well, there's a unique best candidate here. And the other subgroups are just wrong about it. And tough luck, right? And do you have the feeling that I've misportrayed your view? And if so, please correct me.
No, that seems about right. I would say that's about right.
Okay, so why is there a separate argument for this kind of winner takes all? Or so why not go for the kind of overlapping partial different contexts are going to activate different partial criteria, pluralism across the board, right?
Well, I think that just stems from my intuition, at least, that there aren't very closely overlapping nations. I take it as my starting point that, you know, when you talk about the French, you're referring to one national collective, and you don't refer to 3 or 5, such that the word French is indeterminate among them, but you know, there are actually 4 or 5 different nations, and we just confusedly use the word French for all of them. I just took it for granted that this is implausible, so I wanted to develop a view that avoids that.
So, and supposing that were the case, it would just be a brute fact that whatever they share, whatever ties them, as it were, in a red thread, is going to be the best referent to be picked up by context-sensitive uses of the word nation X?
I mean, brute in what sense? I mean, I don't think it's brute. Yeah. I mean, why is it brute? I mean, I don't think it's brute. I mean, it's because you know, generally use, you know, with some provisos, but use usually fixes semantic reference, unless some facts other than use are at play, something like, you know, causal connections or naturalness. But those things, even if you believe that they are important from a meta-semantic point of view, they don't distinguish between these candidate nations. So what remain are use facts, and you know, the use facts are just going to pick the best candidate, which is going to be the most popular candidate usually. I mean, I don't think this is truth.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right. A quick question about that. So just 30 seconds. Okay.
Yeah,
So the Roman Empire. Okay. And it's many of the upper echelons, many of the former citizens of the Roman Empire, even after the empire subsided, still might have thought of themselves and of their mini communities as Roman at heart or something like that.
Yeah.
So was the Roman nation still, did it still exist even after the political entity subsided?
So if you assume that the Romans constituted a nation at the time of the empire, then I don't think it's implausible to say that they did, at least for a while after the Roman Empire subsided. I would add that I'm not convinced that the Romans really formed a nation. So maybe just as a bit of background, I would add there are lots of conceptions about how new as a social category the notion of a nation is. So one school basically says that nations aren't any older than nationalist movements. So those people would say that there isn't really any nation that is older than the 19th or maybe at best the late 18th century. There are other views that say that nations, so Anthony Smith holds this view, that nations are actually a lot older than nationalist movements. Nations sometimes can be traced back for times centuries earlier than that. But I'm actually quite sympathetic to this view. So I don't believe that nations only started existing when nationalist movements came about. It's just that nations existed, but they weren't thought to be the self-evident basis of political organization. But even granted that, I'm still somewhat in doubt that the Romans were a nation. I'm not sure how to define it. I think it was this. I mean, I would need to be a historian to like really confidently opine about that, but I think it was something like a political, ethical ideal. You know, just to buttress this, it was almost like an honorific term. You know, so the Eastern Roman Empire kept calling itself Roman, even though it was Greek speaking and Hellenic and Eastern Orthodox, and you could say that culturally it didn't have really much continuity with the Roman Empire of Julius Caesar. Actually, the Ottoman Empire, when it destroyed the Byzantine Empire, I do know that the first Ottoman Sultan called himself a Roman imperial ruler, and he was a Turkic-speaking Muslim ruler. Not much to do really with Imperial Rome 1,500 years earlier. So I would say that I'm really not sure what kind of category Roman was. I would say it's like a political, ethical ideal, which a lot of people from very different national backgrounds claimed. I'm not sure. I would really call it a nation. But assuming it was a nation, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that it kept persisting after the fall of the Roman Empire.
I see. And on your view, it could also shift. So the term Roman could function as a kind of nation indicator, and then it could shift in a kind of whatever, the republic ideal or something like that.
Yeah, I think that could happen. I mean, on reflection, it's perfectly possible that this is what actually happened. It's quite possible. I mean, just like, to do some armchair semantics, it's called the Romans. So probably the first people who used this word just referred to the residents of the city of Rome. I would assume. That's how I assume it started. But I'm really tweeting on grounds far away from home base. So
yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah.
Thanks so much for your answer. If there are any questions, Asia, Laurențiu, Robert, please don't hesitate.
I can ask another question. Or
Sure.
yeah, cool. I mean, actually, this isn't a question. This is just more of a comment. So I know that you said your project is kind of descriptive and that it's not this ameliorative thing. But I was thinking that at least the kind of framework that you offer might be really amenable to like an ameliorative project, and that could potentially be something you could emphasize if you wanted to, right? So the ameliorative project would say, well, okay, there's, one of these social groups that's actually the reference of, this nation term, but there's all these other potential candidates, right? The other social groups. And the ameliorative question would be, well, which of them would actually kind of ethically, politically be the best candidate, right? So it would be kind of an ethical, moral question of which of those social groups the term kind of ought to refer to, regardless of which one it actually refers to now. And I think your framework is like really nice for that, because in order to even ask that question, you need a plenitude of these things. Otherwise, it doesn't even make sense to ask like, well, which candidate should the term refer to? There have to be, many candidates.
Right. Right.
So I think, yeah, your view kind of offers this nice background to an ameliorative project about nations for someone who kind of wants to do that.
Right. Thanks for pointing that out. So just two quick things about that. So first, I think that's right. I think you're right that the project. I think you're right that the project is amenable to encouraging that question. Maybe just as a piece of short autobiography, why it didn't occur to me to mention that, and that's just to lay my first order cards on the table. I don't think there's any general answer to that question. I don't think. I think if it makes sense to say that I'm something of a particularist when it comes to that question. I think some nations, some nations shouldn't define or redefine themselves as ethnocultural nations for various contingent historical facts. For other nations, it's perfectly fine to do that. On the one hand, I think you're completely right that you can ask that question based on my view. I didn't quite think of that because I personally don't think there's an interesting general answer to that question. But of course, many people will disagree with me on that.
I mean, but even like if you think it's very particularist, I feel like some people who are engaged in an ameliorative project for things like gender and race also would be happy to allow that it's at least not kind of entirely general, right? So people like Sally Haslinger, like they kind of say up front right away, like, I'm working in an American context, it might be totally different for other cultures. And so I feel like there's at least an element of like particularism, even for people working in those areas. So but
that's a fair point. Yeah, point taken. Yeah, that seems right. Thanks.
All right, and speaking to that, sort of the other side of, I'm sorry, Asya, perhaps you had another question. I didn't mean to jump in. Okay.
No, that was it. I've asked enough.
So a quick follow-up to that. Asya suggested something about ameliorative projects. I was wondering about sort of the reverse, about stereotypes. And I thought
you meant like the deteriorative deteriorative.
No. Well, I mean, stereotyping does tend to do that.
Yeah.
Does tend to
Okay.
mess things up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going, yeah.
So this is very much on the fly, so apologies if the example isn't sort of spot on. So imagine that I think everybody remembers the stories of the brave what is it? Soldier Schweik, right? And so imagine that you're a Czech in the Austro-Hungarian Empire about to set to the First World War. And suppose, I mean, some of them were sort of recognized, identified themselves as Austrian, okay, as bona fide members of citizens of the empire, okay?
Yeah.
And so in their sense, if they wanted to refer to the Austrian Empire as a kind of nation, somebody could ask, well, what do you mean? Aren't you Czech? Why do you why do you identify yourself as Austrian? And they could just say, well, that's what I call myself. They wouldn't need to have any criterion for identifying themselves that way, right? So in a sense, why wouldn't one of the criteria that you've listed be, well, I just call myself that way. I call myself Romanian, I call myself French, I call myself Austrian, and so on. And so the question, well, why do you call yourself that way, would be a kind of further question. It would just be a kind of biographical one, right? And yeah, so what do you think about that? And I mentioned that also because I'm assuming that both, especially in times of war that were pretty conflicted, both sort of defenders of the Austrian regime and the Czech nationalists would stereotype each other as sort of not being faithful to the nation or something like that. And so I wonder if that connects with your view.
Well, so I wasn't sure about this last bit. So maybe I'm going to just answer the first part, and you can repeat the second bit because I'm just afraid I'm going to forget what I was going to say. So just a bit picky. I'm not sure about the specific example that you mentioned, because I think the Habsburg Empire is one of the clearest cases of a political entity that was not a nation state and didn't try to be. And, it could be argued that this is part of the reason it fell apart. But again, that's for historians to decide. I mean, about the kind of example you mentioned, that couldn't one candidate notion of the nation just be that I call myself something. Here at this point, I would just thump on the table and say no. I think that in itself, without anything to substantiate it, is too weak, too shallow. Actually, I have a fun case to mention for that, which is it's not a hypothetical case; it's an actual case. A few years ago, there was the Hungarian Supreme Court had an official decision according to which the Huns, there are no Huns. Huns no longer exist. A small group of people in Hungary initiated, they demanded recognition of them as members of the Hun minority, Attila and the Huns. The Supreme Court had to issue a decision that there are no Huns. They no longer exist as a collective. And this story sounds funny because needless to say, the people who claim to be Huns didn't really have anything further to substantiate it. It's kind of a part of a certain kind of nationalist subculture in Hungary to claim continuity with the Huns. It's not really based on anything. So that really was a group of ordinary garden variety Hungarians who just decided that they are Huns. Another example, somewhat close to home, is this is something I just know from hearsay. Some Lebanese prefer to call themselves Phoenicians. Again, to be honest, there isn't really much to substantiate this. because the Phoenician language died out. The Phoenician religion doesn't exist anymore. The kind of culture, this self-conception based on sea trade, maritime trade, and that sort of, it doesn't exist anymore. It's from what I know about this Phoenician claims Phoenician identity. It's something. It's kind of a spite against Islam. There isn't really much to it, as far as I know. So I think you could also somewhat conservatively say that there's some people claim to be Phoenicians, but there are no Phoenicians anymore. That's exactly all there is to it. It's something people call themselves. So here I would give a rather conservative response and say that no, if the only thing you have in favor of a national identity is that you call yourself that's just not enough, I would say. I think this is atypical. So I would just say that these yeah.
But what if enough people do it?
It's a good question. I mean, again, is there anything more? I think it's very rare for a large number of, I mean, all these cases I mentioned, the Phoenicians, the Huns, these are extremely niche movements. I mean, you know, what happens if hundreds of thousands of people call themselves Huns or Phoenicians? Is there a reason they call themselves that? I mean, I think it's possible to imagine a case when there is nothing other than the fact that they call themselves that, but in any actual historical case, there's something else. Yeah. There's some kind of ethnic or cultural or linguistic or religious distinctiveness that characterizes the group. And that would be enough. But, you know, I would insist that in a hypothetical case, when there's really nothing else distinguishing the group than just that they decide to call themselves that, I would say no, then that's just.
Yeah, I was just thinking of this quip from Erasmus, right? That he would call himself a citizen of the world, and that there's this idea that there's a republic of letters, and everyone who was learned enough would be a part of it, and it would unite people from different generations and different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, but all right. Well, thanks so much. If there are some more questions or comments, please, by all means. Well, if not, David, thanks so much. This has been incredibly thought-provoking. And once again, a round of applause for Dr. David Kovacs. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much. You know, small but excellent audience. I couldn't have wished for a better one. So thank you so much for all these thought-provoking and challenging questions. Lots of food for thought for me. Thank you so much.
We're very grateful and very much appreciated, and we very much hope you'll join us soon at CELFIS once more. All right.
Yeah, thank you. It would be a pleasure. Thank you so much, and good night for everyone. Or good day wherever you are.
Good night.